Good afternoon. I would like to thank all of you for attending. I would particularly like to thank my esteemed colleagues for joining me in what I think is one of the most important conversations that we can have right now. I thank SSSP and Corey Dogan for making this a plenary session. And of course, Bristol University for co-sponsoring this. Let me start with a statement. Here within the United States, there's been long-standing calls to uproot structural racism, structural sexism, structural classism. And here within our discipline, as we face the killings of Blacks, the indiscriminate raping of women, the atrocities committed against GBLTQ individuals, the rapid rise in anti-Asian and anti-Semitic and Islamophobia rise, we can't help but join in this conversation about decolonizing and what this means. For much of this, it begins with looking at our roots as an organizational structure, as a discipline, recognizing that it comes out of a European and a European-focused entity. What does it mean, therefore, to center the voices of difference? What does it mean to make their voices priority within this organization? And this is why I've asked my esteemed colleagues, Gozina, and I'm not even going to try to mispronounce your names, okay? So I'm going to let you each pronounce your names, and let's each of you, I ask that you make an opening statement and pronounce your name, and let's get started as listed on the agenda.
Biko Agozino, ekene m unu ndị SSP, ekenekwa m ndị mmụọ n'aka na ndị tutola mbụ ndị nwe obodo Blacksburg ebe m na-arụ ọrụ na VT, Virginia Tech. Ana m ekene ndị Afrịka agbala ohu bụ ndị lụrụ ụlọ bidoro Virginia Tech. So I am acknowledging the Tutola and Monacan people who own the land where I work in Virginia, and the Africans who were enslaved on that land, who built the institution that became Virginia Tech. I am also acknowledging and supporting the resolution to commend the organizers of this conference for choosing such a seductive theme for the conference. I could not miss it for anything. Thank you all for inviting me to join this panel. I look forward to learning from all of you. Thank you. You want me to say more?
Should I?
Next, yes, next on the list, please.
Hi, my name's Gurminda Bambra. I'm teacher at the University of Sussex in the UK, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today.
Is it me? I think it is. I'm Ali Megji. I'm an assistant professor in sociology over at the University of Cambridge, and likewise really interested to talk about the links between global social justice and global cognitive justice with all of these amazing scholars.
I guess I'll go. My name's Julian Go, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, and I'm delighted and honored to have this conversation with you all.
I think I'm after Julian in the list. So my name is Jose Itzikson, and thanks for the organizers for putting together this panel, for putting together this conversation that I think is very important. I'm delighted to be here.
My name is Mary Romero. I'm an emeritus professor, Arizona State University, and I'm honored to be among such the leaders in this field of decolonizing sociology. I look forward to the conversation.
I believe that is everyone at this point. Let me begin by a definition, if you will. Decolonizing is a process that refers to delinking Eurocentric stereotypes. It's associated with theories and pedagogies and methodologies and statistics. Okay, it's definitely aimed at deconstructing this our discipline. Okay, and understanding how historically it has benefited some groups and oftentimes at the expense of others. This is an ongoing process related to the post decolonial struggles that developed in China, in India, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, okay, that challenge who and how information is structured, okay, and how the other gets constructed so often in our discipline. So let's begin with the othering of people within our discipline, and how do we confront that othering, and how do we help reshape the discipline from that vantage point? I'm going to pick on you, Julian, because I graduated from the University of Chicago a few years ago, and it took me a little bit to pay off those loans.
Well, look, I had some thoughts about this issue exactly, and there's lots to say about this. One of the first things I'd like to remind us is that the process of othering in academia and sociology, of course, can't be disassociated from the founding of the discipline. That othering is rooted in a longstanding forms of othering in the discipline, and that in turn, the founding of the discipline is of course rooted in empire. And so when you look at the way in which, say, in the early 20th century, when disciplinary sociology in the United States was formed, when you look at the imperial interventions going on in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, you know, this was a period of high imperialism. American imperialists justified the rule on the grounds that Puerto Ricans and Filipinos were not deserving of citizenship and self-government because they were irrational, they were partial. A lot of talk about their emotionality. And it's interesting when you also then look at the history of sociology and its claims to scientific objectivity. That binary of the irrational and rational, which is racialized, maps onto race within the discipline, right? So, you know, you can look at how Du Bois was treated. I could talk about how some work by William Fontaine in the 1940s, who was arguing that African-American scholars in sociology couldn't do proper science because they were too emotional, they were too partial, they were too subjective. And, you know, what's interesting is Fontaine himself was an African-American. So this is a deep binary structure of othering, and that gets equated and mapped onto imperial binaries of who was deserving of self-government and who was worthy of producing knowledge. And it's deep, and we have to think about this harder and acknowledge it and overcome it. That's what I would say about that's one thing I would say about the othering issue.
Mary Romano, indigenous counter narratives are being produced that both challenge the centrality of European established knowledge systems, while simultaneously recognizing that these counter narratives must be generated, all right, and must challenge the canon proponents, okay, that reasserts the legitimacy of indigenous peoples and their stories. How do we make those stories central to this thing we call sociology?
Well, I think we first have to begin by acknowledging the land that the university is established on and what happened to these peoples, where they are now, and look at the sociology that was created about them, the othering process. Early on in my career, I ran across a book by William Ryan called Blaming the Victim. And his first chapter was very revealing to me. It was called The Art of Savage Discovery. And he went through exactly the way in which people are othered and they're blamed for their own problems. And it was very enlightening, given that what I saw going on in sociology to describe the different cultures in the Southwest was always looking at cultural deprivation, culture of poverty, and the solution was always assimilation. And yet it was very clear to me, and I didn't understand why it was not to others, that regardless of how white I might act, it wasn't going to create a better library for my neighborhood. It wasn't going to create better roads and streets, better housing, anything of that sort. And it seemed when empirical evidence was pushed forward and immigration scholars, sociologists were confronted with this, that they just did a reiteration of assimilation and it took on another structure rather than pushing it aside and really dealing with what the consequences and situations were in society. And instead of looking at the consequences and seeing that as evidence of the problems of the individuals, they could just avoid dealing with any of these kinds of issues.
Gurminder, we are so focused in America, America-centered. We blinded about what's happening outside of this cauldron that we call America. What does this thing called decolonization look like from the vantage point of Europe, from the vantage point of England?
Well, I think there are multiple hierarchies that we have to think about. There's the hierarchy both of Western knowledge, which is something that encompasses both Europe and North America. And then there are also hierarchies between the US and the UK and Europe as well. And one of the ways that I would say that the dominance of the US in particular plays out in the context of the UK is that if we think about issues of race and race relations in the UK, we often import a US-centered model for thinking about race and how we think about minorities within the UK. That doesn't quite work for Britain because in a sense, if we think about Britain's history has been a global history. It doesn't just look west across the Atlantic, but it's also engaged in colonial endeavors across the Indian Ocean world as well as within Africa. So there's many more multiplicities of minorities within the UK than simply thinking about it in terms often of the models that get imported from the US. So I think that's one sort of way in which the dominance of the US Academy plays out to the detriment of good scholarship in the UK. But if we're thinking about decolonization more generally, then I would think that in a sense, there's also the issue of what Britain was and the way in which Britain understands itself. It often understands itself in terms of being a nation, of always having been a nation. And somehow these others just happen to be within the country now because Britain's been too lax in migration or any other sort of narrative. What people fail to understand is that the reason Britain looks the way that it does in the present is a consequence of Britain's colonial past. So it's not that Britain became multicultural when people from darker countries moved to Britain. The British Empire was always multicultural because it encompassed many cultures. And the failure to recognize the empirical multicultural nature of empire means that people fail to understand how multiculturalism is British. It's not something that's been imposed upon Britain, rather it's imposed upon those in the colonies who are now through processes of decolonization and the movements of people, you know, the way in which Sivanandan talks about it, we are here because you were there, points to the reverse journeys made along the routes that the colonizers had previously made. So I think for me, what decolonization points to the necessity of us taking more seriously is actually the processes of colonization. And if we don't understand colonization as the basis for the emergence of sociology and rather think about sociology in terms of the nation state, then we misunderstand what sociology has been about and how we can actually make sociology better.
Biko, much like our Amorocentric ways, we also have a tendency of trying to reduce all of Africa into one nation. and all of its people, we want to make one race, one group. All right. And again, we have this myopic notion that this huge continent is some monolithic whole. Talk to me about what decolonization means and how this would help us to see a much more vibrant Africa, not just a singular, but a plural entity.
Thank you, Rodney. I'd like to start by quoting Samora Machel, the revolutionary leader of Mozambique, who was shot down flying over South Africa during apartheid. And according to Machel, colonialismo is extremo contra humanidade. No a colonialismo democrático, no a colonialismo humano, no a colonialismo no explodora. In other words, colonialism is a crime against humanity. It's not only against the colonized. As Albert Memmi, Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Stewart Hall, and Angela Davis, and others who put it, bell hooks. Colonialism or racism or sexism or poverty is not a problem only for the marginalized, the oppressed, the exploited to solve. It is a problem for us all. Du Bois outlined this a lot, but in sociology, even when we've come late to the party of decolonization, we still look at it as a Sisters of Mercy charity work. We are doing it on behalf of those poor colonized people. We do not realize the extent to which our humanity, as Desmond Tutu will put it, is bundled with the humanity of everyone else in Ubuntu. So yes, Rodney, we want to make Africa into the People's Republic of Africa, one nation for the whole of Africans at home and abroad, just like one China, just like one India, just like one United States of America. That is the goal of the African Union Commission and the goal of Pan-Africanists. Because after 50 years of decolonization struggles in Africa, we still maintain those colonial boundaries that were imposed by Europeans instead of allowing those boundaries to wither away so that we will become freer to move about, to trade, to study, to run for office all over Africa and prevent the internecine genocidal warfare being perpetrated by the terrorist neo-colonial states imposed by imperialism on Africa. So to sociologists who are coming to the struggle for decolonization, I say, you're welcome to the party, but don't look at it as something you're doing for others. It is something in the interest of sociology itself, for a better sociology, that we need to go beyond that conceptual, theoretical improvement of sociology to also address the reality that imperialism is still an ongoing project, as it was said, reminded us in Culture and Imperialism. There is a struggle to recolonize the world, and we must continue the struggle to decolonize the world institutionally, conceptually, but also territorially, so that we can have a more humane world, the kind of world that Angela Davis envisaged, without mass incarceration, without armed policing, without racism, without sexism, without war. That kind of world is not a utopia. It used to exist among indigenous people for thousands of years. When we built no prisons, we had no police force, and yet we ran our societies in more peaceful, more humane manners than capitalist modernity has imposed on us and on everybody else at a huge cost to poor white people who are deluded with the psychological and social wages of whiteness, according to W.B. Du Bois, to continue to be the foot soldiers for imperialism, for colonialism, and for fascism at the expense of the masses of the people around the world. Thank you.
Ali, we have this tendency of trying to lump, again, these binary opposites. We have white, black, And somehow we want to forge or push every group into one of these two categories, and not recognizing that these binary constructs are just that. They're binary constructs that have no basis in reality. How does recognizing the rich diversity of existence, how does that help us to reimagine this thing that we call sociology?
Yeah, sure. It's such a good question. And I think that it reminds me a lot of Paul Gilroy, who himself was evoking Bob Marley when he said that basically the aim of anti-racism is to make the color of your skin mean nothing more than the color of your eyes, right? Because the whole point is that we've made apparent visual differences into social differences, but at the same time, we've made those differences so powerful. There are so many material structures that are now created to make sure that visual difference does translate into material difference, whether that's through new things being set up in the present or whether it's via historical processes which are still in action today. But I think that at the same time, what this does is it also gives us hope, right? Because if we realize that so many of the, well, all of the differences that are invented in social space are invented, it also gives us a suggestion that we can get rid of them, right? If we made them, it means that we can get rid of them. So I think that that's where also when you take a sociological look at things like race and the global construction of race, that's where, once again, we can find those elements of hope. And it comes back to what I was kind of opening with at the beginning of this, when I was saying that global social justice is tied to global cognitive justice. If we're saying that there are so many people across the world that are much different to the stereotypes which race has placed upon them, we're also admitting that there's infinite amount of ways of thinking about the world. I think that one of the central missions of a decolonial sociology, or the decolonization of knowledge and sociology, is basically showing that we don't have to keep fostering epistemic hierarchies between all of these different traditions of thought. I think that what we need to be doing is we need to be fostering conversations between them rather than hierarchies. And it's through fostering conversations, just like how the Zapatistas talked about this notion of walking while asking questions. It is through conversations between different traditions that we're going to move towards a better world for everyone. So that's my introductory comments on that issue.
Raywin, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. We use these terms called social justice, freedom, liberty. We use these terms with the understanding that, or the misunderstanding that they mean the same universally. And although we use the same words, they have different meanings and different histories associated with them. And help me to understand what that means from the vantage point of coming out of Australia and Sydney. How does that, how do we look at that and make meaning and sense out of that?
Well, we do have to look pretty carefully at concrete situations, I think. In Australia, for instance, Australia is, or modern Australia is the product of settler colonialism. So land that had been occupied by Indigenous communities for something like 60,000 years was suddenly appropriated by the largest expanding overseas empire in the world, that is the British Empire, and became a resource for the imperial economy, for the expansion of British power in India, for access to the Pacific and so forth, all of which involved destruction of Indigenous communities and populations, not enslavement in this part of the world, but genocidal effects of colonization, certainly. But as the settlement proceeded, struggles arose among the settler population as well as with the Indigenous population And social justice struggles were articulated in 19th century Australia among the settler population, essentially as a form of class struggle between those associated with the imperial state who got hold of the land and eventually the mineral resources and agricultural exports and so forth, and the working class population which had migrated to the area or increasingly was born here and had its own struggles for, some for recognition, for resources, for income. So in this case, the language of social justice was certainly used, but it was used here in an exclusive way for the most part, with some intellectuals arguing a decolonial kind of position, a critique of the imperial power from quite early, but other forms of inequality and struggle emerging at the same time. And that in different ways, one must say, of the Asia-Pacific region, those kinds of complexities have occurred in other settler colonial states like Aotearoa, New Zealand. They've taken a very different form in East Asia, not always simple case of course, of direct colonization from Europe, but of local hierarchies, local class structures, local patriarchies and so forth, becoming embroiled in the expanding economy centered in the global north. And those multiple struggles are still going on, which require us always to place ourselves, I suppose, in relation to multiple conflicts, multiple notions of justice or equality. And I have to say that the history of sociology is not globally is not an encouraging resource there, right. Because globally sociology has been embroiled in what I call the imperial economy of knowledge, has had the global division of labor, the hierarchies which are now being reproduced by the commodification of knowledge and the commercialization of universities and these appalling league tables that are supposed to tell us what are good universities and bad universities. But on all of these fronts, struggles are going on, and intellectual workers who've got tools for understanding social processes can be of value, can make contributions to all of these struggles on all of these fronts.
We use these terms, Jose, colonizer, colonizing, yet within the American context, there are at least 4 different colonial systems that came into being. The English, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, and the Dutch. All right, yet we use these terms singularly, yet these were multiplicative processes that fed upon each other and in many ways informed each other as they developed. Help us to understand this complex nature of colonization and this terminology.
Well, thanks for that question. I think that in a way, the Du Bois methodology help us address that question. And I will like to contrast Du Bois methodology with existing sociology, comparative historical sociology, as a way of pointing how, the colonization means for the work of sociology. So as you pointed out, there are, we use the word colonization, decolonization, and yet colonization meant different things in different times, in different places. the way often comparative sociology works is by isolating those different processes and trying to establish the characteristics of them and some causal paths or some kind of contrast. The way Du Bois addressed them is by saying, well, there is a global process that is the process of expanding of, racial and colonial capitalism. Du Bois doesn't use those words, but that's what he describes. And that process took very different forms in different places and in different times, because in the same place at different times, colonialism didn't look the same. And the quest for sociology is really to understand those historical processes in their particular characteristics, but also in their connections. And that means looking globally and looking locally. That means looking contextually, but looking at the relationship between processes. Understanding that, say, the United States, Brazil, Nigeria are part of one global process, but it's very different how it unfolds in every place. But at the same time, it has its ties, and those are the historical empirical ties that sociology needs to reconstruct, and the form and how power works at every point in those places and those times. And that's the task of a decolonial sociology, which I would argue is a sociology that is rooted in history, not necessarily an historical sociology, but it's a sociology that is very much linked to the discipline of history and that looks at processes in their historical context. I mean, what sociology has done since, and this was promoted by Weber in Germany and by Park here in the US, is to divorce sociology and history. Sociology and history were to be different disciplines. And I would argue that even historical sociology is an ahistorical discipline. Even a comparative historical sociology doesn't link really to history. History is a field where abstract sociological theories are applied, and it's not a place from where we derive theories, concepts, and understandings. So basically, in order to address the questions that you pose of how to understand these commonalities and difference in the process of colonization, that is at the same time one and many historically, we need to put sociology on its head and bring back the link between sociology and history, between the global and the local, and in particular, take a very critical stand, putting the question of coloniality and colonialism and the critique of coloniality and colonialism at the center of the sociology enterprise. And in that way, we can start thinking about what that concretely means in terms of the practices of sociology to try to address these issues. But I mean, that would be my starting point. I have some thoughts about how to do it, but if you ask me later, I'll get to that.
Thanks, Jose. Sorry. I'm going to say a binary construct. I'm going to violate my own rule. Sociology can either be a tool or a weapon. For all too often, it has been weaponized. It's been weaponized by aligning itself with the corporate elite and the colonizer. How can we make sociology a tool for the colonized?
Hello, do you hear me well?
Well, yes.
Hello everyone, and I'm sorry I had problem of internet, so I didn't connect before. Yes, actually, sociology make us aware of the power structure in knowledge production. So this is, I think, by itself, it's an invitation to look to all the hegemonic power that may affect not only our life, but the way we produce knowledge. However, I would say few words about how, for instance, the concept of decolonial sociology has been understood in the Arab world. And here where I distinguish between the colonial theory or post-colonial theory, where I have absolutely no problem with these theories, and the decolonial discourse or post-colonial discourse, where from the Arab world area, I see clearly how this discourse privilege binaries between West and East.
Yes.
Create so many binaries between universalistic or universalism and contextualism, between religion and science, and so on. And this is this binary, sharp binary way of thinking is not at all helpful to if you like, even to dynamics in the region. Why I insist on this? Because the independence movement for the Arab world is almost a 3/4 of century, and since then we lived under authoritarian regimes. So now to try to think that all our problems come from the hegemony of United States or Israel or Europe doesn't really help to understand how much our scholars, sociologists, account for or do self-censorship not to go to prison. And this is done by the authoritarian regime. They are incapable to understand that our region is a crossroad of different empires, and not only American imperialism. I mean, what is the impact of Iran today on knowledge production in Lebanese universities, where I am in Lebanon, is much problematic than to have the impact of a Western theories on our society, on understanding our society, or using it as a tool for societies. And the impact of the Gulf countries, for instance. Now, the big funders for research in the Arab world is the Gulf countries. So what is the impact of these Gulf countries on injecting conservatism in our science, removing, thinking about good governance instead of democracy, and so on. So what I'm trying to say so far, that I am really very careful today, being in the Arab world, to use colonial sociology, because it can conceive bad dynamics much more than reveal. We need power structures are not only to the colonial moment on. Yeah.
Okay. All right, you're freezing up. I'm going to go to you, Julian, next. Rounding the circle here. All of the major sociological theorists are dead white men. Marx's response for Jews was that, well, they need to stop being Jews. Weber was an apologist for colonialism, so also was Durkheim. As I go through the canon, maybe as a sideline, we might get a woman, on the side. Someone might bring in Du Bois, but we do not have any indigenous scholars that make up the canon of sociology that presents sociology from a vantage point of, and using Weber's term, Verstehen, from the vantage point of the subject as opposed to the object. How do we recenter all of these marginal peoples and make their voices center to what we call sociology?
That's a fantastic question. It's something that a lot of people have been thinking about for a very long time, including my colleagues here on this panel. The first thing I do is suggest that you read Raywin's work. Those of you who are interested in this, but I mean, I think in brief, there's many steps that we need to take. The first step I would suggest, and I've been urging this in various writings already, is to provincialize the canon. That is to recognize that Weber, Marx, Durkheim need to be thought of as themselves subjective, partial, unscientific in certain ways. Maybe not scientific, but that they're coming from a particular standpoint, capturing very particular things about Europe and purporting to make universalizing claims that actually, frankly, can't be necessarily universalized. So one of the things I would, I always recommend to my students when we read these theorists is to situate them and recognize their provinciality. And I still assign these guys. I mean, I assign the dead old white guys, but I think what's important is to read them in a particular way, recognize the particular historical context in which they're writing, recognize that their views are not objective any more than Du Bois's views are subjective. They're just as subjective as well. And they all offer certain truths, but only partial truths. And that's what I think, that's the first step that we need to take.
Raywin, talk to me about this thing called truth. We use it a lot. We use it probably way too much, okay? How do we get away from a truth to multiple truths?
Yeah, well, that's one of the jobs that people interested in post-colonial, decolonial, or even basically democratic perspectives have to work on. We can no longer think of democracy as just one pattern, one struggle, but there's a democratic element in all the struggles that people have mentioned against authoritarian regimes, against colonialism itself, against sexism and racism. I have to say, I think truth is immensely important. Something that a concept that I defend against many of my relativist colleagues, but also I don't pretend it's not a fighting word. It's something that has to be fought for. Look, everyone here is a researcher, and you know how hard it is in actual research to establish truth, a combination of accuracy and understanding that we want out of research. But there are so many pressures to distort what we've come to understand, recognize, and know. Some of them now, of course, coming from our own institutions as universities have become commercialized and knowledge increasingly commodified. There's more and more pressure to misrepresent what we do in universities for commercial purposes, to sell the university services and so forth. It's not only a fighting word, it's an embattled word. I don't have any difficulty with a multiple concept of truth, or a concept that truth is always provisional. I think that's very familiar actually in many scientific traditions. I don't have any difficulty with the idea that our knowledge is partial, but I would stand very strongly for the importance of the concept and the importance of democratizing access to truth. So that connects, I think, with educational tasks of intellectuals and very specifically of sociology, to provide knowledge and understanding that actually is relevant and useful to social movements struggling for justice. That is, as far as I can see it, a core business.
Right. Ollie, we keep struggling with the reality that reality is much more complex than our concepts. We live intersectionally, yet we tend to speak as if race does not intersect with gender, does not intersect with geography, does not intersect with history, so forth and so on. How do we get past these binary constructs and get to the more real existence of who and what we are, this more intersectional kind of sociology?
Yeah, sure. A really good reflection. And I guess it comes back to what so many of us have already been saying, and it's that when we're talking about colonization, decolonization, decolonial options, the construction of race, etc., on the one hand, we are talking about very specific historical moments, because how all of those things played out will be different across different times. So let's think about that in the context of race, as you were saying. To begin with, race was a religious construct, right? When they discovered the New World in 1492, the first thing they said was, "My God, these people have no souls." And the idea of the indigenous people having no souls essentially meant that these people are not fully human. So they actually used religion as a central racializing force for reproducing those ideas of indigenous savagery. And if you skip forward a few hundred years to think about a canonical sociologist, Durkheim, when he was doing research on indigenous people, he was reproducing those very same racialized ideas of indigenous people being civilizationally backwards, but he wasn't necessarily doing it through the same way that, for example, Christopher Columbus was doing it. So I think that it's really important to recognize that when we're talking about the construction of race, we're always talking about race as it becomes attached to different things. And I think that people like Stuart Hall write really well about this, particularly in the case of thinking about class, because in Britain there's a really rich tradition of class analysts who want to separate out questions of class from questions of race. And one of the main critiques that people like Stuart Hall brought to that is class is one of the ways that race actually becomes articulated. It becomes one of the racializing forces in Britain and in the British Empire, as Gominda opened our conversation with. So it's always important to remember that race never gets produced by itself. It's always produced alongside and often through various things. One of my favorite texts to talk about this with my students comes from Angela Davis in Women, Culture and Politics, when she's talking about that period of the 1980s where you have massive cutbacks to social welfare in the US. And one of the ways they legitimated that was through racialized gender stereotypes. So once again, through the stigma of, for example, the Black welfare queen. So they were using those kind of racialized gender stereotypes at the same time to justify cutbacks to the left hand of the state. Whereas at the same time, they were rapidly expanding the amount of spending on the military. So it was not that the money didn't exist, it's just that they wanted to put the money into different things, right? They wanted to expand the right hand of the state at the expense of the left hand. And this is a really good way, once again, of showing how we don't just create race for no apparent reason. It's serving very particular social purposes. And at the same time, when we are creating it to do those social purposes, we're often doing racialization through other means of social categorization as well.
Mary, there's a whole cottage industry that has come into being called diversity, equity, and inclusion. billions of dollars are being spent across the world and within the US as individuals are trying their best to behavior adjust ourselves out of these issues. Us as sociologists suggest that racism and sexism and homophobiaism are embedded within structures that cause behavior. Behavior does not cause structure, but structures call behaviors. How can we approach these massive inequitable structures and bring about change? How can we use our discipline to do that? You're muted, Mary.
Thank you. Probably the first thing is to fight against this notion of inclusion and diversity as simply programs that one can provide their employees or their students and so forth. And of course, as we know, the last 2 years, we have a new position of either the dean or the provost of diversity and inclusive on most campuses. And it's a real easy way for universities not to have to change the structure. So they can point to all these different kinds of programs, they can identify increase of people of color and underrepresented groups, but they don't actually change the structure. They're not doing anything to change the gender pay wage in the university. There's no attempts to make the university more usable by adult students or low-income students. They certainly haven't done much to improve the conditions of adjunct faculty or graduate students. And so I think that the first major struggle is to try and get people to recognize that these programs are just window dressing. They're not actually producing the kinds of inclusion that they're talking about. And that can only happen when we have a really, when everything is on the table to be discussed. And not just simply having these appointments of deans or provosts or having offices at the university. That's a very cheap way of doing it. But changing things like making parking available to staff and free parking available to staff and students would be a major move. Making available affordable food on campus for all students rather than selecting the restaurants that are going to pay the university the most rent, for instance. So there's a lot that can be done on the structure, but it has to get on the table. And so far, the universities are unwilling to place a lot of those issues on the table. Instead, they want to direct our attention on these types of programs and increasing numbers of individuals, although they may not increase the actual number of individuals across disciplines or graduation rates.
Biko, there's a African phrase, I'm not sure which group it is, but it says something to the extent of not until the lions become historians, or until lions become historians, the hunter will continue to be the hero of the story. I recall when someone was interviewing Adolf Hitler and they said, well, what do you think history is going to say about you? Hitler said something to the extent of, if I win, I'm going to write the history. If I lose, it won't matter. How do we get more lions? How do we, sociology is still within the US and the Western world, a predominantly white discipline and male discipline. How do we get more lions into the classroom? How do we get more diversity within our scholars at the PhD level, at the graduate level, and practice? Chef, my phone is talking to me. How do we get more lions there, sir?
Thank you, Rodney. I think that is a Swahili proverb But the irony is that the lion is a hunter, a predator, attacking other animals. And this is a mistake that was made by even Leon Trotsky, who said that a revolution comes like a crouching tiger, concentrating its energy and ready to spring. But the tiger is a predator. There is nothing revolutionary about a crouching tiger because it's terrorizing the other animals in the Republic of Animal, the Republic of Animals, right? So we shouldn't really celebrate whatever the lion says and thinks that is the way to tell the story when the lion itself is a hunter of other animals. We should instead aim to democratize the search for knowledge, but also the struggle to deepen democracy around the world, a struggle that has been led by indigenous people and by people of African descent everywhere they have been, because they have been primarily by women at the receiving end of white supremacist, imperialist patriarchy all over the world. So that is what we should be concentrating our energies around, uniting the coalitions that Stewart Hall called for earlier, right, by using the term articulation, disarticulation, and rearticulation to talk about race, class, gender relations as things that are different but not separate. They are always experienced together. They are therefore should be studied together rather than the way sociologists study them as independent variables.
Yes.
They're not dependent of each other or one another, as the case may be. But Rodney, you've been asking the questions. Can I give you a payback in terms of your outreach, especially throughout last year when you were going around universities and talking about 12 steps for the decolonization of the university?
Right.
One question that came to my mind is, the 12-step program is an individualist program or group program targeting alcoholics by the Alcoholics Anonymous, and by applying that model, not identical, I'm sure because I've read your paper, to the university, maybe because the university as an institution is drunk on power and the abuse of power. How do you reconcile the institutional colonization that you're talking about with the individualist approach, the psychological approach of the 12-point program?
First of all, I believe that a behavioral model will not solve institutional problems. I believe that much of our efforts, this getting a DEI person. But by the way, look at their training. Okay, they want to come and change people's perspectives. They want us to get to talk to each other. It's all behavior oriented. It's not aimed at strategies. It's not aimed at practices. It's not aimed at policies. It's not aimed at institutional values and norms. Okay. The approach that I'm suggesting is aimed at changing the normative practices, the policies, the values of the institution, okay, the core values, all right? And what that means is quite simple. The institution serves a particular political base. Okay, this is talking about colleges and universities. Okay, that institutional base is not linked to, in many cases, the communities. Okay, that they are situated in. Okay, they are serving a corporate structure and a corporate model. And I'm arguing that sociology has done the very same thing. Okay, as we have gone after grants and funding and so forth and so on, oftentimes we are doing the work of whoever's in charge, all right, and paying for this research, all right, as opposed to, and using a religion model, liberation theology. We talked for a minute about liberation sociology. Okay, where sociology was aimed at solving the problems faced by individuals that are trapped in these racial cages. Okay, I come out of a place called East St. Louis, Illinois. Okay, I saw sociologists on a regular basis coming to study these poor people in the ghetto. Okay, I worked at NARC. I worked at SSA at the University of Chicago. Okay, where we did tons of research on those people. All right, but we rarely were concerned about their problems and their issues. We're more concerned about how do we get them to be socially controlled. Okay, all right. How do we control them at a better way? Okay, let me end with this because it's not about me. Okay, the issue is not police, by the way. Okay, the issue is how we use police. The issue is not education. All right, education is doing exactly what it was intended to do. All right, keep poor people poor and rich people rich. Okay, because the way we educate people at places like University of Chicago is radically differently how we educate people in other institutions. Okay, and who gets the scholarships, who gets the grants, who gets these plum appointments, so forth and so on. Okay, who gets published? Okay, Du Bois said, "One forever feels their two-ness." Two unreconcilable souls of being American and being Black. Okay. Well, guess what? We still have that dilemma today. Okay. And that crisis of how do I be both Black and an American? Okay. All right. How can I be successful without giving up my culture and my identity? Okay. All right. Why do I have to copy these others? Why can't I be, and the word is an authentic self? And it's sociology. To be a liberating force means to get at that. In terms of institutions, all right, it starts lifting up these individual cultures and identities. Let me end with this. You think from the first grade to the 12th grade, you have 12 years where the US, you're studying US history, all right? And it's the same damn story every year. You know, 1492, Columbus sailed the blue and discovered America, and all these heathens we had to put in their place. Okay, all right. We never study the indigenous peoples in this country. We never study what slavery was like from the vantage point of the slave. We never look at women in this country, all right, from their vantage point. Okay, we always look at these people from the eyesight, even if all the time when they're Black or female, doing it from the eyesight, the lenses of a white male. Okay, and condemning and constricting these identities based upon that. That answer your question, Biko? Good, because I'm moving to Jose now. Jose, how do we tell these truths? Okay, how do we get these other truths, okay, into this culture? Because I do believe, as Roland said, there is a thing called truth. Okay, and I believe it's out there somewhere. All right, but I don't believe that we spent the time to discover it. Okay, we're so busy trying to be objective and telling our truth, as opposed to what are these truths that are out there. How do we discover those truths, Jose?
Oh, thanks. Well, that's a big question. Yes. As for truth, I mean, I go back to Du Bois just because I've been writing and talking about him, and he always talks about truth. And I was trying to think, what does he mean by that? And what he means by that, as far as I understand, is the fundamental equality of people, that's not questionable. I mean, he lived in a time in which science was openly questioning the fundamental equality of people, and we live in a time in which social sciences are a little bit more disguised, but there, it enters into a lot of the assumptions of current social science, the questioning that fundamental truth. Beyond that is a question of, how do we explain colonialism, or how we undo colonialism in different parts? And that is a question that for us empirical researchers, and there can be different truth or different interpretations based on common facts. But for sociologists, the question of your question of how do we tell those truths is a question, I think is a question that has to do with two things. One is what methodologies we use. And the second one is, who do we bring into the discipline to tell those truths? And the third one is like, where do we look for frames in order to understand that? And that's the quest of decolonizing the discipline, which is to change the frames within which we ask questions and pose research problems. Because the way we have been doing it, it's a way in which it has been excluding people and silencing people in the way that at some point in time it excluded the voice and silenced the voice. So I'm sure that each of us knows someone that was at some point in sociology and now is in the Department of American Studies or African American Studies or ethnic studies or global studies or whatever studies. And if that's their preference, that's fine with me. But what concerns me is that often people go there because, and when I tell the people that I care about, I'm sorry, you are not in sociology, the typical answer is, well, nobody bothers me in the way that with the question, oh, well, that's not sociology, or how that is sociology. So really, in order to allow people in the discipline to tell those truths, we need to rethink what is sociology and how we do sociology. And in that way, we can bring more people, more voices, and more stories into sociology. So for example, you asked earlier the question about there are no indigenous people telling in sociology, talking about the world from their perspective. I mean, there is now a new section on indigenous studies in the ESA, which is good, but there is a lot of work done by indigenous scholars on indigenous studies in political theory, in anthropology, in others, and we need to bring all that and rely on all that. But often we will say, oh, no, that's anthropology. Oh, no, that's political theory. That's something else. And the point is we need to, bring down the boundaries of sociology so we can bring into sociology the thinking and the practice and the methodologies of a lot of people that have been thinking about society and about how to change society as public intellectuals or in other disciplines, or that have been excluded from the academy. And, I made my point of, writing about the voice sociology, and now I'm working a little bit on Anna Julia Cooper, who is another one we should bring to our theoretical discussions. I mean, the question of theory you raised earlier, I mean, it's about building an alternative corpus of theory to the Eurocentric theory. So not that we don't read them, because they are interesting to read and we can learn from them, but that we don't have to rely on them to understand our realities. And we have other corpus, and that corpus of theory is there. We just have to look for it and be open to it and bring it in. And that's how we get to, create a more open discipline where, all those stories that are currently and historically have been silenced, can be told. I mean, and that in part is about, teaching a different corpus of theory, but it's also about a different kind of approach and methodology to how to understand the problems of society. It's about using different methods and about training our students differently. And I think that we owe ourselves a sort of series of conversations of that, because we talk about, I mean, we all here, I see 9 people that all want to decolonize sociology, but unless we come to some understandings as to what that means in concrete terms, the mainstream is going to ignore us, or is going to just push us aside, or just keep doing what it does. I mean, we need to become a kind of social intellectual movement with some, and the 9 of us that I see in the screen may think differently about these questions, but we all can come, I think we all have certain common understandings, and we need to come with a program for decolonizing sociology at the level of all the practice of the discipline, to be able to really bring all those voices, all those exilees that have been pushed aside from the social sciences. And unless we do that, and unless, as long as we go about this as, our individual works and our, as brilliant as those works might be, the discipline is going to continue to ignore us. So there are a lot of practices about publishing, about reviewing, about teaching students, about what is a legitimate research design that we need to really address and push seriously as a collective. Because if we don't act as a collective, we are sociologists. I mean, change comes from collective action, not from individual brilliancy, as brilliant as individuals are. So we really need to a series of conversations like this to come up with a program as to a minimum understanding of how do we need to change the practice of our discipline, so all those voices that you were referring to, Rodney, can speak. Because otherwise we are going to keep being ignored. I mean, we may get, individual recognition, awards and that, but we are not going to decolonize anything.
Professor Raul Perez, I'm sorry, I'm just now seeing that you are with us, our co-host. Please, sir, why don't you take the mic? I'm going to sit back here and enjoy your wisdom. You've got some questions, run with it, sir.
You are here from the mountains.
Uh-oh. Tell you what, send it to me as a chat, Raul. I've got one of your questions. I'll ask them for you. He's having some technical difficulties. One of the questions he asked, and anyone can pick it up, is what would a decolonized society look like? So Raul asked, what would a decolonized society look like? What would that look like? Who would like to jump on that? Gurminder, would you like to start us off?
Well, I mean, in a way, I'm not quite clear about the question, because decolonization for me is a political process rooted in the endeavors of people to overthrow and dismantle the systems of colonization. So
Okay.
whilst those processes have been in place and enacted in a number of places around the world, they've occurred to various degrees. So some places that decolonization has never been total, in many places, in part because if we think about structures of financialization, if we think about trade deals in the present, if we think about the hierarchies of political economy, we see that those modes that are in place today maintain their pathways from colonial histories. So whilst there may have been formal decolonization and political decolonization in many places, there is still an enmeshment within economic structures which haven't been transformed. And so my concern is much more with the structures of colonization that remain in place and what it is that we still need to do around that. It's much less about thinking about social norms or identities or the ways in which we experience society, rather than thinking about those structural issues.
Mm-hmm. You know, again, so often we find ourselves trapped by our own words. Another question that Raul asked is, what is the relationship between decolonization and socialism? One might argue, or democracy, or social democracy. What is the relationship? Can someone? By the way, I was in a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago, and he called me, because I'm a critical race theorist, he calls me a godless Marxist asshole. And I said, well, no, I'm not godless and I'm not a Marxist, and I might be an asshole, but it's okay, you know, because I'm comfortable with all of that. Help me out. Who haven't I picked on? Sorry, help me out here. Okay, we got all these terms, and they mean different things in different settings. But help me out. Is there the relationship between decolonization, capitalism, socialism? Is there or is there not?
Yes, I think there is a relation. There is a relation. This connection between working exploitation, whether this exploitation come from former colonial power or from the reminiscence in economic structures. I like so much what my dear friend Bambara said, that even if we are decolonized, that colonial power is not anymore there, the economic structures and the connection with colonial centers is still there. So I think there is no decolonization without thinking about different forms of exploitations and thinking about in social justice and bringing, if you like, whether real utopia in right meanings. It means more a creative way of bringing socialism back, but disconnecting the socialist experience in many places in the world with the authoritarianism. This is the case in the Arab world, for instance. Southern Yemen, Syria, Egypt of Nasser, Algeria, these all are socialist experience, but in the same time very authoritarian. So in this meaning, end of exploitation cannot be done without a due process of democratization. I mean, again, every time I talk here, when the Arab Springs arrived, or Arab uprisings arrived to many countries in the Arab world in 2011, some of my friends in Hezbollah say we should choose between resistance or democracy. And we will choose resistance against imperialism and Israel. So I disagree with them. It's not either or. We can do both. So I think this is a point, that the centrality of social justice and democracy in any project of if you like, decolonization is extremely important. And often I argue, when I study a major part of the left in the Arab world, that democracy is not really in the top of their agenda, and sometimes it's not only in the low bottom of the agenda. It's not in their agenda. Look how many leftists today in the Arab world uploaded the coup d'etat in Egypt, how they upload the coup d'etat of Qais Said in Tunisia, just because the new elite in the power, they don't like it. So actually, it's very interesting. The very leftists that they call for the end of French colonization, for instance, in Tunisia, is the same they they ally themselves with the France today against the local elite and some of them Islamist. So, and I said some of them, not all of them. So there is really, it's amazingly, I mean, there is a slogan of decolonization, but in fact, you ally yourself with the colonial against your own local elite. This is really the story of the counter revolutions in the Arab world.
Raywin, so often we stumble over one utopian vision after another, one heaven on earth or hell on earth, and the question becomes, whose utopia? Again, I keep coming back to whose truth are we going to try to promote? What does the good, at the core of our discipline? I remember the word the good society. It goes all the way back to Plato and Plato's Republic. It seems like we've had this conversation for centuries, okay? Be it in religion or be it in sociology or be it in philosophy, so forth and so on. The question is, how do we achieve this good place? Or is that the wrong question to start off with?
No, I think it's a good question. I think we need utopias and utopian thinking. I'm totally in favor of encouraging it on a mass scale, not just among professional political philosophers either. I think it connects with who we are as a workforce in a field like sociology, and who is the audience and colleagues and comrades that we want to connect with. Utopian thinking occurs in the grassroots too, not just among the philosophers. One of the books that has most inspired me, I must say, is by a Swedish writer called Sven Lindqvist. It's a book called in Swedish, Dig Where You Stand. And it's about a popular social science movement, supported by the unions in Sweden, where groups of workers have researched the history of their own jobs and come to understand the social and economic relationships that have produced the actual situations that they themselves are working in. It's wonderful stuff. And I think, there are actually many democratic knowledge movements out there that the professional knowledge workers like us should be connected with. And in those movements, there are, I think, utopian visions. And that's lovely stuff. I think it's good to do that kind of thinking about universities too. But that's not all that we have to do in sociology, because I think there's also, we can never lose sight of the critical thinking that sociology has to do, which is a task that we can do for radical social movements too. So, I mean, when I was a graduate student, all those days, back in the 60s, we used to call this power structure research. And it was a big thing for sociology, and perhaps has gone a little off the boil and should be encouraged much more. We should have hundreds and thousands of sociologists researching the power holders, the authoritarian regimes, the 1%, the patriarchs, and so on, in real detail, and spreading that knowledge where it can really bite, where it can be useful in local as well as broad-based struggles.
One of my major complaints about many of the papers in sociology I read is that, and particularly something like social problems, I stopped reading social. I stopped teaching social problems because for me, it became very depressing because it seemed like we went from one social problem to another social problem to another social problem. I said I want to teach a course called Social Answers or Social Solutions. Okay, I wonder as we move forward, are there some practical things that we can suggest that we can do right now? That we can move the discipline or not our careers, but our own sociology forward. Okay. Gurminda, could you start us off? And I want this is a round robin, so we're going to work our way around everybody. But what are some practical things that we can do that as sociologists that would get the move us into this thing called decolonization? And it's, by the way, it's a process, not an event.
I mean, for me, one of the things in terms of thinking about decolonizing sociology as a discipline is to understand the way in which sociology has been formed in colonial structures and to think about how that has shaped the various concepts and categories of sociology. So I know earlier in the conversation, there was some discussion of dead white men and the way in which there's a particular canon of sociology and how we need to bring other voices in. I think that's incredibly important to do. And at the same time, one of the things that I would argue for strongly is the need to also think about how we decolonize the concepts and categories of sociology, because the issue isn't just simply who has been recognized as a sociologist, but rather what in the work that has been recognized as sociology, how that has been organized around particular understandings, which even if we got rid of thinking about Marx, Weber, Durkheim, we would still probably use many of the concepts that they have established that have come out of colonial histories, but that haven't acknowledged the colonial context from which they've emerged, and they've been presented as if they're national categories or European categories or Western categories, when actually they're categories that emerge from colonial histories, and the effacing of colonialism is what's problematic. So in a book that's just come out, and I think it's actually just come out in the US this month, called Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, that I co-authored with John Homewood, the key thing that we argue for in that book is that the focus, and we start with Tocqueville, we talk about Tocqueville, and then we do Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Du Bois, and we frame it also in terms of thinking about Hobbes and Hegel, and thinking about the way in which the tradition of social theory has come about. And our intention in the book is not so much to critique the canon, but to think about what the canon has bequeathed to us as a discipline in terms of those concepts and categories, and think about how acknowledging their context as a colonial context will shape the way in which we think about these things. So paradoxically, we argue that to decolonize sociology, the first thing that we need to do is understand the colonial context out of which sociology has been formed, and then thinking through those issues will give us the resources to reconstruct those concepts. And so our focus is less on the figures, and I would say that we should be less focused on the figures of sociology, but more on the concepts of sociology and what it is that they enable us or not enable us to do.
Ali, help me out here. A practical step that we can do as sociologists in this process of decolonization.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll probably follow on from what Gominda was saying, because I think that, you know, from the top of my head, there are kind of like three concrete things that instantly hit me when we think about, okay, what are we going to do practically as professors, as teachers, as instructors in sociology, and as researchers in sociology? What are, you know, concrete things that we can be doing to push this decolonization of knowledge and sociology? The first point is actually just kind of what we've been talking about for the whole time, and it's to learn from those who have already walked the path, if that makes sense. By which I mean to basically to take inspiration from those who've already developed and pushed the decolonial mission, which we're now trying to legitimate in the 21st century. So if you think about, what we see with Du Bois in the current day, so many people, like you see with Jose's book with Corrida, so many people are trying to bring valuation to Du Bois's work now, not just to recognize his historical contributions to sociology, but because of the basic fact that his paradigms of thought and his concepts that he was using help us to understand society now in the present day, right? So you can see that in the way that he linked, for example, racism in the US with coloniality at large in books like Black Reconstruction, where he was describing the exploitation of Black labor as being the foundation stone of the whole world economic system. So on the one hand, one really concrete, easy thing that we can do is simply just to look back in order to basically move forward. One thing I'm really interested in as well is what Julian was saying at the beginning of this conversation, which Gominda also just alluded to, and it's the fact that sociology emerged in a world of colonialism, right? It became formally institutionalized at the high point of global colonialism, characterized by a world of empires. That means that basically for the majority of sociology and sociologists that we teach, we can very easily situate it in a colonial and anti-colonial context simply because that was the historical context in which it was happening. So this is basically referring to applying the central principle of sociology, that all knowledge is socially situated, applying that principle to sociology itself. So for those who still really want to rigidly stick to the holy, to the holy canon, the canon, which they treat as the gospel, you can actually look at those key figures which are taught in a sociological canon and see, oh, it's really easy to teach these people in anti-colonial ways or post-colonial ways, whatever way you want to frame it. With Foucault, for instance, who we know is canonized not only in sociology, but across the whole arts, humanities, and social sciences, he said himself that his whole view about power as not being a possession, but as being a network, and his whole methodology of studying power not as a top-down imposition, but studying it at its moments of bottom-up resistance, that came from his involvement in anti-imperialism in Tunisia. Similarly with Pierre Bourdieu, his whole notion of a field as being a quarreled space of a quarreled area of social space characterized by competition over distinct forms of capital and competition over the power to classify. That also came from the context of post-colonial, anti-colonial Algeria, right? And even beyond redeeming Western social scientists and Western social science, and kind of saying, oh, there are these people that we typically think of as being Eurocentric, but we can kind of reclaim them in a post-colonial fashion. We also need to be thinking about embracing the anti-colonial roots or the anti-colonial context of sociology by looking at the South-South links that existed in social theory and in sociology. One of my favorite examples being how Ali Shariati and Frantz Fanon came across each other when they were both studying in Paris. So they both traveled to the metropole, which is a whole different conversation around intellectual imperialism, which I'm sure we can have later. But it was Shariati who was translating Fanon's works so that Iranian revolutionaries and Iranian intellectuals could really engage with that anti-colonial work in the same way that Ali Shariati's work encouraged Fanon to see that religion wasn't simply, a bourgeois ideology that was used to brainwash the proletariat, but could itself be a vehicle towards revolutionary ideology. So, another really easy, concrete thing we can do is simply to just apply sociology to sociology and embrace the fact that the majority of paradigms that we teach happened in a context of either colonialism or anti-colonialism. And just a really quick final point, I think it's also really important for us not to forget that whilst we're concentrated so much on bringing valuation to those sociological paradigms which are overtly anti-Eurocentrism, anti-Western universalism, there also exists some paradigms that simply exist outside of Eurocentrism itself, right? So if you think about Ibn Khaldun, he was writing 500 years before Weber. So 500 years before Weber was basically saying that the whole of the Asian continent was unable to civilizationally develop. Ibn Khaldun was already writing about the dynamic, albeit circular dimensions of all of these societies. So we also need to be concentrating on those who exist either, what people would say at the borders, or what some people would say outside of that whole structure of Eurocentrism and Western universalism more broadly. So I think that those are some easy, concrete things that we can do.
Thanks. Mary, same question. Something concrete that we can move this discussion forward.
In terms of American sociology, I think it's crucial to recognize that we have been impacted by colonial history. And I think that it's too frequently our students as well as our colleagues think of colonialism as being something that happens outside of the United States, not within the United States. And looking at the ways in which sociology in the United States has been used as a means of social control. I know when I was doing my research on domestic workers in Colorado, I was quite surprised to find out that the first sociology department that was created and maintained was established at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, or the CF&I. And so from that very beginning, they were using it to control their Mexican-American as well as immigrant miners and their families, and to get them to be more ideal workers and so forth, and not to, and it was also a way to break up solidarity of miners who were attempting to try and unionize, as well as to create divisions among the various groups of miners, making certain groups scabs and some of them not. And I think those mechanisms of social control continue to work today. I think that some of the ways in which we experience interethnic or racial conflict in this country has been largely fueled by sociological concepts about our differences, about who's the model minority, without ever contextualizing how certain immigrants arrived to this country and what their experiences are. And sociology in the United States has been used to a very large degree to maintain the ideology of America as being the land of opportunity. And so, as I mentioned at the very beginning, one of my concepts that I hope to see the end of is assimilation, which completely ignores and erases a generation of parents that suffer and work extremely hard to help their children move forward in their own lives. And instead it's attributed to the American dream. And so these kinds of concepts and approaches used in sociology do little to unite people, to get us to think about how our problems or issues are collective rather than individual. So I would like to have those kinds of conversation about the way that colonialism has impacted the development as well as the continuation of how we use sociology today.
Mary, you reminded me that the term, one of the most central terms that we're currently using in sociology is systemic racism. Systemic racism did not come from sociology. It came from Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party, as they were using sociology, okay, to look at and try to transform the structure. And we get a lot of terminology from indigenous social movements, okay, who are grappling with this behemoth. Talk to me, Biko. Help me out here. What is one thing that we as can do to bring about this process called decolonization of either the discipline or, yeah, let's stay with the discipline.
Yes, more of us should be activists, sociologists in the tradition of liberation sociology as theorized by Joe Figgin and his colleagues, or public sociology by Bora Woy. We should demand, for example, an end to the embargo against Cuba for more than 50 years. What has Cuba done to be embargoed by the US compared to other despicable regimes around the world? Why are you targeting this small country that has never really threatened America, that has only offered scholarships to American students who want to come and study medicine for free, with the promise that they will be committed to treating the poor in their communities when they graduate. We should recognize that Cuba, small and poor as it is, played a dominant role in the defeat of apartheid in Africa. So there is a relationship between socialist countries and anti-imperialism. And this relationship goes all the way back to Marx, setting up the first International Working Men's Bureau in Manchester to oppose the proposal for England to enter the American Civil War on the side of the slave masters. And the First International said, if you do that, we will go on a national strike to oppose such a reactionary move. None of the other guys you are mentioning as European sociologists ever organized anything of that scale. Even while Weber studied China, he did so from an imperialist perspective that looked down on China and said that China lacked trust compared to capitalism. Capitalism is not based on trust. Capitalism is not based on the Protestant ethic that Weber obsessed about. It was based on the exploitation of millions of the labor of Africans for hundreds of years. That was called built capitalism according to Marx and according to Du Bois. That legacy, that tradition of opposition to imperialism runs from Marx to Lenin, from Lenin to Gramsci, from Gramsci to Mao, and all the way to our time by the Castro brothers. And therefore, at the current time that we are facing a pandemic, there is a lesson here for the whole world that we can learn from socialism. The problem was first observed in China, even though it could have existed in other parts of the world, but we are not picked up by their scientists and scholars and researchers. China identified it, and China took steps to keep this pandemic under control in dramatic fashion. Now, imperialism is arrogant. Imperialism says we can't learn anything from China. They don't have any technology to teach us. Well, come on, bend down low, ask China, what did you do differently? One thing that China did differently, of course, is that medication is offered to the Chinese people, not on the basis of who can pay, but on the basis of need. That is the same story in Cuba. And now, reluctantly, almost reluctantly, America is saying, okay, you don't have to pay for the vaccine. Initially, they thought we would want to pay for it. Even the test today is still paid for by us to get a COVID test. So why don't we take this model of the COVID intervention and apply it to healthcare all over the world to say that if you are facing a health problem, then the society should address that need, not on the basis of who can pay, but on the basis of need. That is what we are doing with public libraries in America. The public libraries are set up on the basis of socialism. If you need to go to the library, you go, it is free of charge. It is at the expense of the public. That is what we're doing with K-12 education. That is something we should do all the way to university. Cuba does it all the way to the university. So yes, there is a relationship between capitalism, imperialism, in opposition to socialism. The error that those socialist countries have made are real. They have been seduced by imperialism to obsess about militarism and defense, wasting resources that could have gone into the improvement of conditions for the working people and for internationalism. I, as a child, survived the Biafra War when Soviet Union, for some reason, sent MiG jets to a dictatorial genocidal regime in Nigeria to bomb us. And Egyptian pilots volunteered to fly those jets because Nigerian army pilots couldn't fly them. Britain offered mass supply of small arms to the Nigerian army so that more small arm fire was expended in the 30 months of the Biafra War than throughout the 5 years of the Second World War, according to some sources. at the cost of 3.1 million lives, including the use of starvation as a legitimate weapon of war. So the question is, why did America go all the way thousands of miles, sending young people like Rodney to go and fight and kill Vietnamese who never called him the N-word? And Rodney returned to America recently. He revealed to us that he was traumatized by that experience. It drove him into a drug habit that nearly destroyed his life. Why don't we, from this conference, rise and call for reparations to be paid to the people who survived 400 years of slavery and 100 years of colonialism? Why don't we rise from this conference and call for an end to the war on drugs, which is a war on poor people? Because we can use education to end drug habits rather than use it as an excuse for mass incarceration targeting predominantly people of color.
Thank you. Sari, you're next up. What can we do?
Yeah, exactly.
Julian,
thank you for your
are...
question. Yeah, and I will reply as a this time as a president of the International Association, ISA, said what we have done in the last years or decade, actually, it's really this, I will talk about two levels. The level of publications, that if you look to our editor of journal editors, that most of them are located outside of the global north. I mean, Elvisa Martin from Brazil, Martha Solar from Spain. I mean, let's say from the south of the global north, and others. So this is one thing. The second, that we had a new editorial policy that we accept submission in languages other than English. So somebody, let's say from Latin America, will submit his paper in Spanish, and all the referee process will be in Spanish until the paper will be ready and then will be translated into English. So we don't ask reliably that a paper should be publishable in English, because I know how constraining this point. So this is in the level of publication. I will talk about another level of when we organize forums and congresses, and really I have a long work with the program committee of ISA for the Congress of Melbourne, how to bring more voices from the South. And I think my dear friend Geoffrey Player, the VP of Research, the way he organized the virtual Congress of Porto Alegre is also bringing so much name in plenaries from the global South. We try more to get money to have more more grants to enable people from the global South. So if you like, concretely, we can do things like this, which really can, if you like, address all these issues raised by all my colleagues about how to decolonize our discipline. In conceptual level now, I would say ISA is really pushing for a concept of global sociology. And I know Gurmendra wrote about that. But I'm just, I will focus about my colleagues like Michael Barawi, like Margaret Abraham, Michel Viviorca, myself. We wrote so much to say we need a global sociology. And if you like, my last paper about what is the global sociology, I said we need 3 conditions to have a global sociology. First of all, positionality. So no one will write from France and say, I represent the world. No, you represent only France, and positionality as a French. And second, and I will say gender positionality also, male, female, etc. I mean, it's not only about nationality. The second is to do more comparative research. So to go beyond your nation state research. And the third conditions is to have what I call a soft universalism. Soft universalism, I know many people don't like this word because of terrible history of universalism, but soft universalism in a sense that we need to acknowledge that some concepts, some values belong to humanities and develop within the humanities without necessarily having a tell-you to say this is the end of the history, and no, and it's not because this concept has been forged in the Euro-American context, but it has, if you like, a quasi-consensus all over the world. So we can bring many concepts of universalism, of soft universalism. Okay, so that's it. This is what I want to say.
Thank you. Julian, what one thing can we do to help move this project forward?
I'm just going to add to what everyone's saying. I agree. I would say two things we could do, and that's specifically we need to learn to think differently, and we need to learn to ask different questions. And that does mean, first of all, rethinking our history. I've written about how sociology has been rooted in empire and how that relationship has shaped the concepts and categories that we ask. As Gurminder mentioned, it also shapes the questions sociology has asked. So we need to recognize that history so we can overcome the blinders. And secondly, I think we need to learn to think differently in the sense of reading new people and teaching new people. And I mean some people in specifically, and I mean the anti-colonial movement. For me, I've always argued that what we're calling decolonization, the decolonial project, what I call the post-colonial project, must be recognized as rooted in the anti-colonial movements of the mid-20th century that provided an alternative framework to the dominant sociologies that were being tied to empire. So if you want to overcome the imperial and colonialist blinders of sociology, one place to look is to the alternative forms of social thought that are rooted in anti-colonial thinking. Fanon, Cesar, Amilcar Cabral, all these people actually addressed and thought hard about all these questions you were asking earlier. What should be the relationship to socialism? What does a decolonial society look like? What does utopia mean? What about universalism versus particularism? You know, people long before us have thought about these issues, and the anti-colonialists were the ones thinking about them. Marx, Weber, Durkheim didn't think about these things, and at least in the way that we would want them to. These alternative traditions need to be used as a resource, and we need to seriously engage with them if we're going to learn to think differently and make a bigger difference.
Thank you very much. One, I've been corrected on offline. Systemic racism did not originate with Turi. They did, by the way, popularize it quite well to the rest of the masses and people. Jose, you are up now. Bring us home, sir.
Okay, well, a lot has been said that I agree with. I mean, we need to think different theoretically. We need to think about how our concepts have been constructed and deconstruct them. I think we need to bring other theories because a lot of the things, as Julian was saying, that we are dealing with, other people did. But I want to focus on something else. I mean, we often have been talking about changing the whole world, and we should think about how we reproduce sociology as a colonial discipline in the small practices of the discipline. So I'll tell you, for example, how we teach students, or what do we teach students to do. I have my students that, you know, they all have big projects, and you know, they go and practice with their friends, and they come traumatized and come to me like, I don't have a puzzle And, you know, they ask me what my causal model is, and I don't know. And, you know, those practices of teaching students, you know, about causal models, you know, asking causal questions and putting small puzzles are so embedded in our students and in our practices that people reproduce them. And and in a way, you know, that's what the discipline expects. So people need to be able to deal with that, but we need to give them the tools to feel certain that that's not the way to do sociology. It's just one way, it's not the best, it's not what they should aim to. That, you know, there are questions that are not causal, like, you know, the famous Du Bois questions, like, you know, how does it feel to be a problem? That is a sociological question that doesn't call for A affects B. There is the questions of, you know, that you were posing earlier about freedom, liberty, you know, how these ideas become what they become, that are about the formation of our world, that have, you know, causal paths embedded in them. But the idea is not to tell, you know, in Germany, this kind of variables created this, and in France, this, that, and it's about connected historical process. It's about rooting these ideas in historical processes, in connections, in resistances. So we need to teach students that, you know, it's important how we form students and how we tell them, you know, to stand up and give them tools to stand up to the, oh, what's your puzzle? What's your causal model? Because otherwise we are just reproducing the usual way of doing things. And the usual way of doing things is very, very poor sociology. Another thing, I mean, there are a lot of things that I've been thinking about that. The other thing I've been thinking about is publish. How the hell we get the mainstream journals to publish our research, or we delegitimize the mainstream journals? I don't review for ASR, I don't review for AJS unless they send me something that I think, you know, it may be a little bit, I won't waste my time with the mainstream discipline. It's not worth my time. I review for journals, I don't know, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Du Bois Review, others like, you know, Theory and Society, that tell me, but we need to think, we need to have a policy and a politics of, you know, the ASR is our journal, it's the journal of the association, and it's, sorry for my French, I'm sorry if I offend someone, it's a shitty journal. I challenge you to tell me 2 interesting articles that you read in the journal. I can tell you, Eduardo Bonilla Silva about the racialized social system, and recently Victor Ray in my 25-something years career. So we need to think strategically and politically about how to open these journals or how to delegitimize. Say, no, ASR is not #1, but these are, I mean, we were talking about how to change the whole world and how the colonized societies think. But we need to think concretely about how our daily practices reproduce that world and how we can do for our professional world, which is the world that we can actually change, in which we can actually do something about. So I'll leave you with these questions, but I think that we need to think and talk and come up with ideas and practical programs about this, because otherwise the discourse about decolonizing this discipline is going to be, to stay in the very abstract level, and we are not really change the way we practice the discipline, which is the one thing that we can try to do.
Let me, first of all, thank you, the panel. I mean, this is the reason I came into academia, and this is one of the best conversations I've had in my 30+ years of being in academia. Thank you so much for demonstrating what happens when people come together and have a conversation. I want to invite you to one next step that we can pull together an edited volume. There's plenty of places we can get it published, and I'll be contacting you about that. But as we close, I want to suggest that this is the beginning of a conversation. It's not the end of one. For the 75+ folks that attended, thank you very much. We appreciate you sharing in this moment with us. SSSP, this is how it's done. Everybody, thank you very much. Be blessed, and we will be in touch. Have a good one.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
I think we're out of time.
Time says 6, so we still got 30 minutes.
Is it at? Oh, okay, my bad. Questions? (3:30 to 6). Okay. I'm not seeing any questions. The session ends at 6. So I am sorry. We can keep going then. If there are no questions coming out of the session, you panel, you got some issues. What haven't we covered? You got some questions yourselves to each other.
There is a question. Someone is raising their hand.
Where am I seeing a hand?
I just saw it. Well,
Please send us over chat or
I think I noticed.
Yes, send it by chat. Send it by chat. Your connection is poor. Send it by chat.
Corey,
Type it.
Mary, I think
Type it in the chat. You're not coming
Raywin had her
across.
hand up as well.
Yeah,
Type
please
it in the chat. You're not coming across.
yeah, type your question on chat, please. Yeah, Rodney, there's a question that was raised earlier that I would like to comment on, and that's
Please.
the question of truth and objectivity as a problem that we should not reject, that we should all admit that we aim to be objective in our work, and there is nothing to be ashamed of when we say that, when people say that Du Bois was being subjective. I think we should defend Du Bois against any suspicion that he was making things up. We are not making things up either. Du Bois was objective, but he was committed. So in my work on Black women and the criminal justice system, I call that committed objectivity, that we are committed against racism, against exploitation, against sexism, against imperialism. But that doesn't mean we're making it up. We're still objective as scientists, as social scientists. Ain't nothing in the work of Du Bois that is not empirically tenable or theoretically inconsistent or ineffective policy-wise. So he is objective. I think I am objective too. And I think Rodney is objective, and so are all of us here. However, when we are forced to make that choice between objectivity and subjectivity, very many of us choose subjectivity, including radical feminist thinkers, but that is a trap, you see, because even the conventional sociologists who claim to be objective, they do not like subjectivity, but they try to claim objectivity and exclude us from that claim of objectivity. We should proudly commit to committed objectivity. That's what we do. We are against injustice, but that doesn't mean we are making things up. We're still telling truths, although our truths can be falsified when you find evidence to falsify. So far, nobody has falsified the claim that racism, sexism, imperialism is a threat to humanity. That's not dogma. That's not subjectivity. It's based on observable reality and the ongoing struggles. We should be aware of rejecting objectivity, because then the right wings will say, aha, we told you, they're not really scientists, they're not really sociologists. What they are doing is ideology, not sociology.
Yeah. Elijah, and I'm not going to try to mispronounce your last name on chat, raises the following questions. It's open to anyone. Question on institution and the historical context. Can UNESCO help to decolonize education through its Futures Education 2050 project? Anyone feel comfortable in addressing that question?
Sure.
Please.
UNESCO is a useful forum. I've spoken at it on issues of violence and gender. It has outreach. It has, in fact, supported indigenous cultures and the development of indigenous knowledge projects over the last 20 years or so. So it's good to have that that raised to expand our ideas of the forums that this work can be done in. But UNESCO is not an actor in the sense of a center of social power. I mean, all the United Nations institutions are basically outgrowths of diplomacy, of intergovernmental relationships. They're not popular institutions. So I don't think, although that's, you know, a way of circulating ideas and knowledge, it's not going to be the kind of force for change from below that I think most of the people in this panel are looking to. Now, there are popular education movements. I mentioned one, and there are many other. And I think those are important audiences for sociology. I think one of the things that might come out of this, of this panel and the thinking around it, is some re-examination of who the audience for sociology is and how that audience can be expanded, democratized, and help to become knowledge producers and not just knowledge consumers. So I'm glad that education has been brought into the discussion. It really is a crucial thing we do and a crucial field we should be working in.
Mary, you're next. You had a comment or question? No? We've got a question then coming from Josephine in the audience. I have a broader question. Is interdisciplinarity of particular importance to decolonizing sociology? I would say yes, automatically, but someone want to step on that, or shall I?
I'll respond to that. I want to build on what Jose was addressing earlier about the ways in which scholars who continued sort of the tradition of Du Bois and the settlement movement and so forth ended up in interdisciplinary programs. And we lost a couple of generations of sociologists that way. So I think reading the works from interdisciplinary scholars is important to bring us back to our roots of scholar activism and doing sociology for people rather than for corporations.
I would argue that sociology is at its core interdisciplinary, that you cannot do sociology without looking at politics, history, anthropology, economics, so forth and so on. I mean, when you think about the classic sociologists, they did all of these things, and I know I've used that term loosely, but what those, when I read Du Bois, I'm reading history, I'm reading rich history, okay? But also when I'm reading other works like Frantz Fanon, all right, who's not coming out of sociology, but I think he's doing some great sociological work when talking about, you know, the wretched of the earth, okay? It's a classic piece, and obviously Oliver Cox, and we can go on and on in terms of naming Pat Hill Collins' work on Black feminist thought is a classic, and you cannot do a damn thing without citing her or reading her. Anyone else? Sir, talk to me, Jose.
No, I fully agree with you. I mean, Du Bois was the paradigmatic scholar and he was interdisciplinary, but I would say, as you said, that sociology is interdisciplinary But I think that there is a kind of struggle to define the meaning of sociology, in which many mainstream sociologists try to erect barriers, saying, sociology is something very, very limited. We are about causal analysis, about the effects of these variables on that through this methodology. And the decolonizing impulse should be about lowering the walls of sociology, making sociology an ecumenic and more ecumenic and more interdisciplinary as it is. I mean, over the years of my career, I have encountered many colleagues that have, express, they have kind of economics envy, like, how in economics they, sent away economic history and institutional economics and all sorts of branches of economics and became just a very narrow discipline. And they would like that for sociology. And I laugh, the one thing that brought me to sociology is really that I say that, sociology is the closest thing that you can be to, Danmark's phrase that you will be a philosopher in the morning and a hunter in the afternoon. In sociology, you can be, an ethnographer in the morning, a quantitative scholar in the afternoon, and a phenomenologist at evening. Coming out, speaking about the freedom of thinking and things that you can do. I think sociology is, in that sense, the broader of disciplines, but that's something we need to defend and expand. Is part really of what I understand as decolonizing the disciplinary practices.
Anyone else?
Can I jump in? Because
Please jump in.
First of all, I'll agree with that Du Bois comment, because he did his PhD in history, right? And then he was also in philosophy. He wrote music, but we claim him as one of us. We claim him as a sociologist, right? And one thing I find really interesting when I was reading Raymond's work actually was that if you think about the holy trinity of sociology, of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, only one of them really saw himself as being a sociologist, but wasn't seen by other people as being a very good sociologist. And yet we're so happy to claim them as the founders of our discipline. So it's really hypocritical how we've got to a stage where we have really rigid boundaries in sociology, while simultaneously teaching people who wouldn't necessarily have been classified as sociologists prior to them being canonized in the first place. And I think that once we start thinking otherwise, or kind of bringing valuation to those other paradigms, what you see is that the boundary between sociology and other disciplines is porous at best, or simply non-existent. So if you think about Shariati, in his prose, on one page he's citing Marx, on the next page he's citing Weber, on the next page he's citing verses from the Quran. So it's kind of like the mixture in his account between theology and sociology is porous to the extent that it would not pass in ASR or whatever, right? Because we have really strict boundaries between theology and sociology.
Well,
so yeah, it's contradictory, I would say, how we've got to this stage in our disciplinary history.
I'm ecstatic that our volume, The Matrix of Race, is coming out in the second edition. And one of the things that we did, it took us 7 years to write the first volume, by the way. But one of the things that we purposefully did was go way outside the boundaries of sociology, mainly because it's just like Marx. Marx says, I'm not a Marxist, okay? And we have a tendency of defining and very rigidly defining what is and is not. And in the process, I would argue that we don't see a lot of things. And some of this has to do with the discipline's insecurity about trying to prove to the world it's just a science, okay? Rather than trying to demonstrate that there's utility for its knowledge, okay, and the truths that it unveils, okay. No, it seems like we spent the last 40 years trying to prove that we were a science, and we ignored some of the original principles by which we came into being, okay? We came into being because of problems, okay? And we were actually faced with, how do we keep from self-destructing ourselves, okay? How do we regulate ourselves, okay? How can we coexist in this increasingly global world without going from war to war to war, okay? How can we solve our problems, okay? We've gone away from that to where we become the problem as opposed to solving the problem. Okay, talk to me. Other questions?
Yeah, can I chip into the question
You
you just
always can chip in, Biko.
Okay, I would like to say that the problem is not interdisciplinarity, because you could still have interdisciplinary social sciences that are imperialistic. And that was a point made by Claude Ake in a book, Social Science as Imperialism, because the social scientists from different disciplines were promoting imperialism in the guise of development studies across Africa, and he was against that. We should recognize today that critical race theory is under attack in many states across the US, perhaps in other parts of the world. It's being banned. Books are being banned. Books are being burned in the US rather than promote dialogue and interdisciplinarity that is also intersectional. So any social science or sociology that is interdisciplinary or whatever, but without developing awareness in the struggle against racism, sexism, and imperialism would be impoverished, because these are the dominant questions of our time, not simply the question of race, because that is what the people who are opposed to critical race theory are perplexed about. It is not simply about race. It is also about articulation or intersectionality between race, class, and gender. And the question about UNESCO ties into this, because the essay by Stewart Hall in 1980, Race, Articulation, and Society Structured in Dominance, was actually published by UNESCO in a volume called Sociological Theories of Race, in which Weber was included, Durkheim was included, but they were only commenting on one case, the Dreyfus affair in France, of discrimination against a Jewish French army officer, whereas the chapter by Stewart Hall that you can download online, Race, Articulation, and Society Structured in Dominance, is a classic. It's almost a book. That was what he gave to me when I was doing my research on Black women and the criminal justice system, and he set me straight theoretically. So I would encourage scholars to go and read it, but also to learn from the example of students in Ali's department at the University of Cambridge. They organized something called Decolonizing Sociology Network and forced the university for the first time to include Du Bois in the syllabus for sociology students, and to invite Angela Davis to come and speak in Cambridge. We should ask ourselves, what kind of sociology are we teaching? To the extent that some of the best sociologists never studied sociology, while those of us who were trained in sociology are busy counting sheep.
Yeah.
Right, so that's a problem right there, that the best sociology is being written by historians, by philosophers, by novelists, rather than by sociologists. That's a big question that we should be asking. Interdisciplinarity is important, but so also is intersectionality. So I move that this conference should add to the resolution a support for critical race theory that is under attack across the US.
Yeah. By the way, I would argue the following things. One, the reason why critical race theory is under attack is because critical race theory is doing some critically important work. It would not be attacked if it were not doing critically important work, okay? If people are not coming after us and condemning us, then I would suggest that we're not rattling the cages of what we're supposed to be doing, okay? I believe that there's a question that come up in the chat. We spend a lot of time worrying about our students getting employment and having jobs, and some argue that we walked away from our vital mission. We become careerists, or we become more concerned with maintaining a job than doing the work that we came in the discipline to do. I believe that we can do them both. I believe that we can walk and chew gum. I do believe that we can critique the empire and talk about structural changes And yes, I believe our students will get jobs. And let me tell you why. Because one, we will get more students in our courses. Okay. Why? One of the reasons why we don't have more students in our courses, I would argue, is because many of us in the discipline have been more concerned with speaking not change to the system, but how do we go to bed with the system? And our students are not fooled, and they understand that, guess what? You're lying, okay? You're not talking about solving the problems in society. You're actually become the problem, okay? And then I think it gets in terms of truth in lending, okay? That we must be true to who we are. And by the way, this brings us all the way back to the whole purpose of this conversation, okay? And by the way, I want you to look at reparations, telling the truth, okay? Providing healing, okay, and restructuring not only the discipline, okay, but in the process, our communities, okay. That's what we're about. Talk to me. I got Jose, and I got Ali, and I got Biko, okay. Talk to me, Jose. No, we just heard you, right? Talk to me, Ali, and
Jose,
then Jose, then Biko.
okay, cool. Yeah, reparations, and this comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. This is essentially a conversation about cognitive justice, right? So with the birth of colonialism, you didn't just get the destruction of land, you didn't just get the destruction of subjectivities, but that whole destruction was based around destructing the epistemologies, the principles that people live by, right? So when I'm thinking about reparations, I'm thinking about the fact that in order to actually save the world from being destroyed by the climate crisis, it requires us to go beyond dominant Western modes of social thought, right? It encourages us to go beyond an idea that there is a strict binary between humans who have agency and nature, which is simply something that we're opposed to, right? It requires us to think about nature in a way that all other cultures around the world have thought about it, in terms of something that itself has agency, something that nurtures us, which we also need to have a relationship of nourishment towards. It requires for us to go beyond liberal responses to a climate crisis, where we think that individual choices like food consumption patterns are going to be the answer to a problem of global capitalism and global coloniality, right? So when I'm thinking about reparations, I'm really thinking about, first of all, bringing back, giving respect and giving valuation to those systems of thought which we devalued through colonialism in the attempt to devalue their land, exploit their land, and exploit their subjectivities. And I'm also thinking about reparations on a global scale, to the extent of, if we want to save the world, and here I'm thinking about reparations towards the world itself as a living being, if we want to save that entity that has agency itself, we can no longer think in terms of these strict binaries that Western social science and social thought gives us, because it's going to lead us to a very dead end.
Thank you. Jose.
Okay, there was a lot that you, I mean, that you read. So I wanted to just address the part where I said, well, that our students were, I mean, you know, the kind of obligation that we have to our students to, you know, help them get jobs. And in a sense, you know, students come to us because they want to become sociologists, but we need to help them to become critical sociologists and get jobs as critical sociologists. And I think I agree that we will get, if they do their work well, they will get jobs, because they will be unique in their fields. I mean, they will be really innovating, but we really need to you know, to teach them to navigate the field without falling to the, you know, the sirens of the field, and really, you know, internalize alternative practices when they become professionals and when they train their students. And that's how slowly we can try to change, you know, the consensus, the hegemony of how we do this thing. And then we can, you know, that will mean, you know, that will educate a new generation that will think about the question differently, about the question of reparations, about the questions that Ali was raising. And that's one part of what we can do in the struggle for decolonization. And I think that that's very important in a sense to train our students well, to help them get jobs, but also to train them to, in a decolonial mode. I mean, I just say something a little bit, a small thing that I always get a little bit frustrated about when, I encounter students that want to be critical. I understand, and they understand critical about destroying any kind of theorist or approach that they encounter. It's this extreme criticism in which they have to show their individual brilliances. And I always try to explain them that being critical is really about trying to mount a critique of things as they are and thinking differently, and not by destroying, whether it's Du Bois or Anna Julia Cooper or whoever, but by taking from them what we can take to just think about the world differently and think about our practices differently. And I think that's one small task. I mean, it's small comparing to changing all the world, but it's something that is within our grasp to do, which is within our reach, and it's something that we can do, but we need to understand that we need to do it consciously. Otherwise, we were also trained in the same way and we reproduce the same practices. I'll just leave it at that.
Biko, you got 1 minute, sir.
Thank you. I would like to end by calling on us to move beyond looking at decolonization as a metaphor. And this is a tendency that is developing in the humanities, where they use the term decolonial. Again, not by sociologists, but it is becoming a very popular catchphrase, decolonial studies, rather than decolonization struggles. And this was a point made by Tuck and Yang, that decolonization is not a metaphor. It is a struggle for the land rights of indigenous peoples. It is a struggle for reparations. It is a struggle against the prison industrial complex and for penal abolitionism. It is a struggle for wage equality and marriage equality around the world. These are practical struggles that are ongoing, that we as sociologists should engage with and learn from, but also help to advance, because colonialism is a threat to the whole of humanity. Fighting against that threat is not a work of charity for the benefit of some. It is in the interest of the whole of humanity to pitch in and resist the expansion of imperialism even within our discipline. Thank you.
By the way, anybody that wonders about the career options available to a critical sociologist, everybody on this panel has jobs that's working quite well and is getting paid, all right, and are tenured and are publishing and are critical sociologists, okay? Every sociologist that I know is a critical sociologist that is dealing with some of the critical issues facing us. I want to thank you and those that had to leave. I want to thank the audience. Again, this has been the most phenomenal panel that I've ever had associated with. Thank you very much. God bless you. Be good. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Well done, right there. Well done for hosting.
All right, gentlemen. We'll be in touch. Send me an email. I'll put you on our listserv if you're not on there. But you all take care. Good talking to you. Nice meeting you too. Bye.